Don't you love that, ladies?
Yeah, so
Beautiful
American.
computer. No, well, it's like what's his name? Like Stephen Hawking's
Yeah. But it
female
sounds like she's in the
sidekick.
airport, or she sounds like she's in an airport kind of announcer.
Okay, Louise, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with me today on the show. What I normally start with is just to get a little bit of an understanding of who you are, what you do, so for the benefit of our listeners. The main thing we need to convince them is, why are you someone worth believing and worth trusting when it comes to customer problems? So Louise, tell us a little bit about your story and what you do.
Well, I've got a background in product design. So the first sort of interaction with design I had was studying three-dimensional product design, and that was many years ago. So we're going back sort of 25 years ago. And product design was a really silly thing for me to do because I live in a small country that doesn't manufacture anything. And 25 years ago, there were very few women getting into product design. So not only could I not find a job when I graduated because we don't manufacture anything in product design as manufacturing, but then there also was this kind of, I mean, I think that I was the only girl of 20 who finished my course. So there was that as well. So that was problematic. But when I was doing my product design, I got really interested in the marketing of these products. So how were we going to make these things? And then where were the markets? How were we going to get out into them? So I had a professor who was quite interested in helping me. And he was constantly pushing me to do things like think about how are you going to commercialize that? So we were slanted towards making very furniture-based things because that was pretty much all we could market and manage in New Zealand in terms of manufacturing. But he pushed me down plastics, and that was far more commercial. And I got into trying to understand that, and that helped me get my first job, which was much more of a marketing job. And it was for, of all things, a real estate agency. And so they had nothing to do. It was a service business. And that was so different from what I had studied. But what I soon learned was design is something that once you learn the basics of it can be applied in any space, and certainly has a connection with marketing. And so that was the early part of my career. And then about a couple of years into that, 5 to 10 years into it, this thing called innovation became, and the internet was becoming something. So I'm on the verge of everything becoming digital. I started my career online with those horrible pages that look like yellow pages. And my first job was we sort of had the internet, but we didn't really use it that well. And so I went into the workforce at that point, and I soon find myself in a bank, and they were an innovative bank. They were trying to transform themselves and use technology. And I was involved in projects without the experience because no one had it, in digitizing things and making digital experiences. And so my background in product and graphic design helped me get my first sort of like footstep into this design innovation space.
Because banks and financial services were one of the first, I guess, users or early adopters of all of these different services and professions
absolutely.
and ways of working. I had a similar situation, and the reason I think that happened, or we had that kind of tailwind behind us, is precisely because of how complicated services, businesses, and banks, and the minute they grew, they almost desperately needed people to help them get closer to the customer because they had lost kind of complete touch with that, right?
Absolutely.
So okay. So you landed in a bank, as many of us did, and you were working in an innovation team or working in some sort of product design team, very UX.
No, it wasn't. It was not UX UI. I was very lucky. We actually had we were doing something really experimental, and it was a strategy and service design team. We didn't call it that in the time. There was this word of service design didn't exist, but a consultancy.
And you were a woman. You're like triple pioneering here.
That was fine because the people running it were marketers, and that was a much more feminine team. It was a bit of a more, I suppose, an even split. And so they were novices, and they had drunk the Kool-Aid in terms of design. They'd had a consultancy come in from Australia, because I was in New Zealand at that stage. And they'd had an Australian consultancy sort of sell them human-centered design. And the interesting thing about this bank was their early history was as a mutual. So they did get looking after their customers. Their customers were them. And although they'd been bought out by a big Australian bank, there was still that DNA there. And so the CEO bought into this wholesale. And so I was lucky because it came top down, not bottom up. And that
what a
was
difference
probably,
that makes.
absolutely. And I thought this was normal. And it kind of spoiled me for the next sort of 20 years because I've never kind of ever been in a place where that kind of sponsorship from the top down has been as fulsome. And so it was a great opportunity for me, and I spent 4 years there, and I got such leeway to work on projects. And the other thing I was super lucky about was I worked with 2 ethnographers. So we hired 2 people whose sole job was to do ethnographic research, and they came from an anthropology background, and I learned my craft of ethnography and doing qualitative research from these 2 experts. And so combining my design, absolutely, I was so lucky. It was my second, it was like doing a master's in ethnography and design thinking. And so
pretty early on,
very early,
in the industry.
And I was youngish. I was sort of in my sort of early 30s, late 20s. And I was very keen and thought I could save the world and change the world. And we got to work on some really cool projects that did actually deliver to customers. And then the internet happened. And so then we became quite agile happened. And we were first adopter of agile. Lots of problems with that, going from waterfall to agile and trying to do design and innovation all at once. But it was a real university for me. We spent a lot of money too, so they had the bucks to spend. So that was great, sort of early foundations of my career, and I was very spoiled. And then I went into the real world, and I've got many battle scars from that, post that experience. But I had saw what good looked like, and so I know that it's possible.
All right, and so what does good look like? What is what's the problem that you help these organizations solve?
So I think, first of all, we work in teams. And so what good looks like is when everyone's aligned. And so when you have the right sponsorship and you have the right space, and, money was part of it, but it was more risk taking and commitment to trying something out. And we were working on projects that were part of the core of the bank, but we also could hothouse things. We got time to do stuff. So some of my projects were quite long. Like they went from really early discovery to delivery, took 2 years sometimes with some of the things that we delivered. So I didn't have the same kind of time pressure I've had at other projects. From my perspective, what I was doing was a really dualistic role. So I was the designer, but I was also the researcher. So early on, we sort of split that up, and our ethnographers would go do the research and we'd tag along. And then it would be sort of the insights would come to me, and then I would try to work on the solutions. But as time went on and I matured as a researcher, I was much more involved in designing the research, conducting the research, then the design. But I also, there was no one to do the delivery in terms of the design delivery. There was no UX or UI. And so if I wanted my pieces of work to actually go from the vision that we had to actually being executed, I embedded myself in the delivery team. And I think because we just didn't know what we should be doing or how teams should be constructed, I was able to transition from those really early stages right the way through. And so what you get when you get me is someone who understands the real strategy concept stuff right up front, but I know what it's like to work in a delivery team. And then over my career, I've worked in different ends. So I've gone down the UX UI end and then right up to the strategy end. And so I have my preferences, but working with delivery people, working with developers, being able to speak to people and understand the business context as well and the different parts of the business, that's been, I think, the key thing that has made me successful as a designer and different to my peers as well.
From having worked with you in the past, I think one of the things that sets you apart is precisely your understanding of the commercial drivers of the venture and your willingness to get your hands dirty, not just stay at the cool and skinny jean end of design. Okay, so Louise, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the common problems that you found the businesses that you work with have had. A lot of the people I work with, I see them falling into a couple of traps, and they, in no particular order of priority, there's usually a trap around not really knowing who the hell your customer is. So having assumptions, beliefs, guided or misguided about who they are, what drives them, what their jobs to be done are, et cetera, et cetera. There's another, and then, okay, that's I think one big problem. And then the other problem is what some people call the innovator's bias or the entrepreneur's bias, whereby I have a solution in mind. That's what propelled me to even go out into the world, start my business, start this project, whatever the case may be. And now that I've got this idea, which I know is going to be the next best thing since sliced bread, I'm going to work back from that and to identify the problems that it's solving. Or I don't even think people are even going that far. They're just saying, right, I've got this idea, let's sell it now. And you're like, well, but what problem are you solving? And does your user even give a shit, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a place for that, because you need motivation. If as an entrepreneur or an innovator, you need motivation to get you started. Otherwise you wouldn't do this. But I completely agree that one of the big problems is our own internal bias. And for me, that is, it's also, it goes beyond that. It's not really understanding the context of the space that you're going to go play in. And very much as you say, it's falling in love with your solution and not understanding, it's not always your solution might not actually be addressing a problem, and that's fine. Problems are great if you can find them and you address the solution. Sometimes you think it's so new, it's a new need or new want that you might be creating, something that's desirable. But really, what you really want to do is really understand the context of where this is going to fit. And
what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the context?
So the context is everything about the place that's going to land. So the people, what's motivating them? Why would they like this? And different groups of people, maybe different archetypes or different kinds of people, are going to like it for different reasons. And if you don't understand the context of that, and also the context of your own business, and if those things don't match up, so your ambitions, your purpose, and what you're willing to do and where you're willing to go versus what this potential market wants and needs, if those things don't line up, that can be really problematic. It also can be the potential solution. That can be the sweet spot. But if you don't go and sit in that space and understand it, and you've got to have that helicopter view, but you've got to have the detailed view as well. And I think we make assumptions. We don't know what the market really is, what the market really wants, but also why. So we might do, some high level surveys or find out, yes, people like this, or there's a potential problem we're solving. But if you don't deeply understand what are the trade-offs that those people are going to make by taking up your solution, then you can fall in love with the solution and not really understand the problem space or the jobs that people are trying to get done and how it fits into their lives. And so we spend so much time developing our solutions, and we then fall in love with our solutions. We're attached to them like they're our children. We don't really recognize that other people are not going to see that. And even if it's a great solution, there's so much more around that. Maybe the trade-off that people will have to make to access your thing or to understand your thing, they're just not going to take the time to do it. So if you don't go and spend the time to do that, it's a huge risk that you're putting out there on yourself, because you haven't kind of been unbiased, stood back and seen it from another point of view.
There's a good way I've heard this sort of referred to is, people aren't really aware that they have a problem. It's like, okay, well, good luck convincing them that your solution is worthy, right? But what I was getting at is chances are, even if they don't have a problem, they are addressing that problem somehow.
Exactly.
Right? They have some sort of solution, some sort of workaround, some sort of competitor, something that you don't even think is your competitor. And the only hope
it's a totally
in
different
hell,
industry.
Yeah. Yeah, and the only hope in hell that you have is to convince them that what they've got is inferior to what you're sort of proposing, right? And so it's almost like by picking out the problems with their existing alternative, do you stand a hope in hell of kind of saying, hey, look, my solution has some legs.
Yeah, even if your solution is better, even if it's more cost effective, the human beings are highly efficient in what they're not lazy. They look for the most efficient path, and moving or even giving you the time of day to think about your solution and how it might fit them, that can sometimes be enough of a barrier to stop people from trying. We get very comfortable and people go, well, this would save them this, or this would deliver that. But the cost of actually lifting your head up and giving it enough time can be enough to make people stay in their own habits and not change. It's really important to understand those risks and how you're going to move the dial, how you're going to move them to see that. But that's if you're lucky enough that you've guessed correctly and that your solution actually does address the problems.
What the problem even is. Okay,
yeah,
good.
Yeah.
So this is good. Let's work back then from this. So you're in this utopic state, and yes, you've finally managed to get someone to look beyond the comfort and the convenience of their current solution, and they're like, oh, there's a better way, and Louise has just offered it to me. How, let's assume that our listeners have that solution in mind, right? How do you work back? Let's work back from that. And how do you actually identify the problems? Like, can you share some sort of examples of techniques or times when you've had someone hire you with a solution in mind and they're like, right, Louise, we need to kind of justify this, back this up with research? And
yeah, well, I always think of it very much as like being a scientist. So I'm trying to break down the elements of that solution that they've got. What are the benefits? What are the differences? And then it's about taking those out, and you can use various forms of research to do that, to test with people which bits of this do they like, but under what situations, what kinds of people like it, why. And it's always going a couple of layers further down in terms of the why. So what are the drivers behind this that are making people like that part of the solution or that feature? It's again, it's context. It's putting it into context, because you don't want to throw out that surrounding, because otherwise you're not really understanding the full picture. You think it's this thing, but it's actually this plus this, and that's important. And if we need to make a change, if we find that some aspect's not working, we don't want to change in the wrong direction. We want to be able to go, but if we tweak it this way, or if we iterate it this way, or if we take these things into consideration, then your solution might be able to slant a little bit to meet the needs better, or for this group, it'll meet the needs better.
Can you give us an example of a time when you've put together like solution plus context? Or,
yeah, I suppose the
problem?
thing, one comes to mind very quickly, and there's probably lots, but we found, I was working for an insurance company, and we found that there were 4 key archetypes of people who went through a particular channel. So this was about which is the right channel to sell the product through. And they had a couple of people that would go through a channel that was very expensive for the insurer. And then there was a cheaper channel, which was the online channel, which would be cheaper for the insurer. So they didn't have to pay as much margin. But we found that there was reasons why it would be better for one type of archetype to leave them through their preferred channel, and which one you'd have a chance of moving to your online channel. And so if we came up with the same solution for all those different groups, we risked losing or really pissing off their valuable customers. So although there was a higher cost to acquire, it was better off that they left them in their preferred channel, because otherwise, and they were the cream of the crop. They're the kind of people you want to insure. Whereas we found that the other kind that were, and they're the majority, unfortunately, they're not interested in being educated. They're not interested in having fulsome cover. They want the cheap, dirty kind of insurance. You're better off moving them to a digital channel and not putting them through your expensive channel. So it was like, but what's going to speak to them versus what's going to speak to someone else? And so we found these subtle groups, these kind of differences, and that was then a strategy that we could kind of decide, do we want to go for this group? Can we size this market and see if it's worth having different sub strategies or solutions for the different groups? And so that one comes to mind. But without spending time with people and starting to identify why they behaved in a certain way, with the same product and the same channels, we really needed to understand the broader context and what was motivating.
Yeah. Now this is you've reminded me a couple of things. A lot of people are either unable to, are unskilled, or they believe that they can't, or I think it all comes down to fear. So people like to hide behind a survey, hide behind some sort of research report that they pulled from the industry, and people are kind of afraid, or again, unable to, unskilled to have real customer conversations.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to explore a little bit of the way in which you get in front of people, and look, consider that most of the people listening to this have never practiced design. Probably they loosely know what design does, and probably it's more closely related to UX design than any other kind of design.
Yeah.
So if you could share your sort of do's and don'ts, or what's if I know there's no quick and dirty way for this, and I know research is a whole kind of profession, but to help others out, like how do you do this? Why should you not just go for a survey?
And I think if you're going to go for a survey, then you really want expertise in designing a survey, because you cannot, anyone can make a survey. There's all these tools out there, but even when I'm going to do a survey, I sit down with a quant expert who's going to help me design that, and I need to know the questions and what are the limitations of that.
What's wrong with doing the survey yourself?
It's highly like you wouldn't do science yourself. You wouldn't and it's that kind of, it's at that level. It is a very precise measuring tool, and so you wouldn't pick up a scalpel and start poking around, hoping that you're going to get the right part of your body and save yourself. And so it's very similar with that kind of research. It's clinical. You've got to know how to ask, what order to put things in, and it's real art. And so these
otherwise
people who go,
it puts you on the wrong scent.
You'll get
it sends
false
you down
data.
The wrong path.
Yeah, absolutely. Your data just will not be reliable, and you will be.
Would you buy my solution? Yes, no.
Yeah, exactly. And so you just can't. I mean, you can learn, and you can buy things, packages out there which will help you do some things. But if you're doing bespoke research, I would use an expert for that. When it comes to the kind of research that I do, which is much more conversational, and we want to invest the time in an analysis, but I do believe that anyone can do the kind of research that I do with a few key things. And so what I always do, the first thing is, if I'm doing sort of broad exploration, I don't really know very much about the topic, I will try and identify at least a couple of people I think that might be the target group that might buy into our solution, that might be aimed at. And we're doing, we might be talking to 6 people, we might be talking to 30 people. Do what you can afford, but even one is better than none. And the first thing is to have a couple of questions, and they can't be leading questions. They've got to be open questions, and you've got to be prepared to have a conversation. But you need to
explain the difference a little bit about a leading question and a non-leading question.
So you're not going to put something in front of someone and explain it like a demo, and then say, do you like this? Do you not like this? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Because even saying what do you like and what don't you like, you're already saying to the person you must like something and you mustn't like something. And that's very sort of limiting. So you want to more explore their attitudes towards things, their beliefs, the context of their life. And I would always pair a conversation and an interview, it's like a one-on-one interview or conversation with some observation and some other things too. So not just talking to people and hearing what they say back, but what do they do? How do they do it? Why do they do it? Where do they do it? And so it's a bit of contextual inquiry too. But first, before that, is really knowing, what am I trying to find out? So why am I going to sit down in front of this person? And I wouldn't go with too many things. So 3 to 5 things that I want to find out about them, and I want to find out about my area. And I never ask direct questions. I get them to tell me a story or explain what they're doing. I might show them my concept after that point, and then say, how would this work in your life, or how would you use this, and get them to step me through it. And so it can be as simple as a conversation if you outline it well enough, Or it could be a bit of, sharing some material with them, or showing them, something that you've already got, a prototype or an idea, and talking them through it, and then getting them to critique it and kind of give you some critical feedback. But I always want to know more about them first. And it's also a great way to warm people up. So often what I do is I tell them a little bit about what I'm doing, but I don't reveal too much. I get them comfortable enough to kind of go, we're trying to learn about innovating in this space. This is the kinds of things we do as a company. And we just want to talk to people like you to get your point of view. Because when you talk to people, they'll quite often say, oh, other people might like this, or I don't like this, but my neighbor might like that. And so I get them to say, don't worry, we'll talk to those people. We'll talk to people like that. You tell me what you think. And so that's really important, because we tend to want to please people that we're talking with. And so they might tell you about a bunch of other people, or they'll make a whole bunch of assumptions. And so it's about really letting them understand you're interested in their point of view, and focusing on your objectives. Have a design of what you might ask them, but also being free enough to just listen and have a conversation. And I record listening. It's all about knowing what you want to answer, and then listening to what they say, and also listening by observing. So often people will say one thing, and then you'll ask them, probe a little bit deeper, but what they do is very different to what they say, and they don't even realize that's the case. And so those are the things that you really want to note down, is like, what do they say and what they do, are they the same? I'll give you an example of a really interesting one that we did. We're doing something for like a superannuation letter, just a simple letter that was going out to customers. It was something we needed, the business needed to send from a regulation point of view. And we were getting a lot of problems. These letters were coming back into our branches, and people were asking, what do I need to do with this letter? So it was costing, and they didn't have to do anything with it. It was an information letter. They could throw it away. They could file it. They could, ignore it if they wanted to. But especially people with English as a second language were going into branches, going up to the frontline staff and saying, what do I do with this? They didn't know. So it was wasting people's time, and it was also really frustrating. And so we went into people's houses, and we showed them some new ideas. We listened to them about what they did. And these were all people who English was a second language. We had some translators with us too. But then I asked them to take me through what do they do with letters normally? And we learnt about the special drawer that everyone has where the letter goes, or the box, or the pile. And then I said, what do you do with the pile? After 3 months, then the pile either goes into the rubbish or the shredder, or it gets filed. And everybody had these different rituals and different kind of ways of taking the correspondence they had in their life. This was before, when we had a more post. But everyone had this messy drawer with stuff that was sort of semi-important, but not that important went. And it gave us some clues about what we might do in our design. So it wasn't just asking people, because they didn't tell me these things, but they showed me these things. And so it was the combination of listening, but then asking them to kind of really act out, or show me, or demonstrate. And you could also then see, going into people's homes, or doing a Zoom chat. Like, I actually find out a lot about people when I'm doing a Zoom chat, because that's what we've been doing now during the pandemic. We can't go into people's houses, but you learn a lot from the background pictures they have. So even if you can't see their house, the fact that they have a screensaver on, what's that screensaver? What does that tell you about them? You learn more about people when you observe, and when you're not just listening to what they say, but how they are. Yeah. And so you can, I think, learn. It's practice. We've all been in interviews. We all interview and talk to people all the time. And so it's more about starting small, if you're doing this on your own, building up your confidence to really ask questions that are focused on some objectives, but that are open, and let the conversation meander. The second part's the harder part. So you're going to come out with a lot of data, and it's what do you do with that data? Because it's different to a survey, which is neat and tidy. You've got your answers there. Percentages, you push a button, and that's the harder part. And that's the bit that takes a bit of practice and training. And that's the analysis part of it is trickier. That's where the art comes in, that people underestimate.
And there's a couple of things that came to mind as you were speaking. When I've had situations where the objective of the research was to put a prototype, a demo, a mock-up in front of a customer, right? And we're so hell-bent about putting this thing in front of the customer that it's like, yeah, okay, warm up, context, thank you very much. What do you think? Now, I've seen that happen. I've been part of that, I think we all have. But let's just say that the enlightened way that I've learned since is you almost need permission from the customer before you can introduce a solution, right? And what I mean by permission is not like, may I now introduce, but I mean more, okay, you have actually understood my problems and and your solution is relevant. So yes, I want to kind of consider it, as opposed to like, oh, no, you've completely missed the mark. You have no fucking clue who I am.
Yeah.
Oh, but anyways, here, let me take a look at your solution. Give me some feedback.
There's, before you go and see people or talk to people or bring them in, you should know something about them. So sometimes you'll use an agency to go and find people for you. Sometimes you'll use your own network, which is dangerous because they're too close to you.
Yeah.
But sometimes we have to. That's just the best we can do. But you should know something about people. And I have also fired people who have shown up to do research. They haven't been the right person. So you have to have a criteria in mind of the kind of person you want to come talk to you. You don't want the serial interviewer who's always doing this and they're just doing it as a job. That's not very helpful. And there are those people out there. And you need to be careful because they will bias your data as well. You want to have people who are close to your target group, that you think your target group is, as much as possible. But you shouldn't exclude people because they might have language problems or disability or anything like. If that is your group of people, you need to make sure you get a balance and a well-representative sample. And that's the design of the research is actually probably as important as what you do when you're doing that. So people think of the interview or the research as the pre-design of it is really important, and it helps you be more successful. And so I'd always advocate for hiring someone who knows what they're talking about, or to do a bit of, get some advice from someone who knows what they're talking about before you go out and do research. But I always take my clients with me. In fact, it's the thing that really annoys me is when the client or the people my fellow project workers don't want to come on the research with me. I learn from them coming because sometimes they ask great questions too, because they're close to the product and I might not think about things, or they're close to the system or the company. And I know that my stakeholders who come and engage with it get so much out of it. And the storytelling that comes from going and meeting people and talking to them and showing them your objects or your kind of prototypes is so powerful, and that really helps people to connect with the problems or the situation or the context and start to fall in love with that rather than being so obsessed with their own solutions. And so I think going to speak to customers and doing it on a really regular basis, I've seen great managers or leaders of companies who insist on every week or every month speaking to real customers and talking to them about what's going on for them. It's no different if you're trying to do something new. You should be doing it as often as you can. And I think sometimes spending smaller budgets and smaller amounts of time, but more often, is worth it, rather than doing these big research projects up front or at a critical point. It's those little kind of little bit often, I think, is much more valuable. Again, it seems counterintuitive, but I've seen better results from that.
Yeah, I also advocate for the continuous research, I guess, is because as your thinking matures, then the conversation that you'll be able to have is far better than the first conversation you ever had with 5 people that sort of met that customer segment that you're targeting.
Yeah, and you get into it, but you get to learn what works and what doesn't. You improve your style as well if you're doing it.
And you're testing different things. You're researching different things. You might start off like, I want to understand your context. And now a couple of rounds later, I'm ready to start presenting solutions to you.
And quite often what I'll do is when I'm doing that, if I've got the luxury to do that, is my original cohort of people that I might have done the deep dive and contextual understanding I'll invite some of them back, like, a sample of those people to come back, plus a few new people. And so always there's some consistent thread all the way through. So some people might go from the beginning right through to the end with me as research subjects, and other new people will come in. And so that's good because they're almost co-designing it with you, but you're constantly bringing fresh thinking, because if you bring someone with you on the whole journey, they start to become almost part of the team, and they can fall in love with the solution too, and they stop becoming someone who's helping you with your research, and they start to become part of the design team. But it is good to do that, and you find a couple of people who are really articulate, or they're really good at expressing themselves, or they're really helpful, or they're really oppositional. Like that, you can get people who are really useful, who are always saying, go harder, this is not good enough. You need a bit of a balance there. You don't want just people who tell you what you want to hear. You want those critical voices too.
Okay, so a question on this. I've encountered a situation where you start off with a hypothesis of who this customer is, what they look like, their behaviors, their needs, what have you. You're exploring context. Okay, there's some sort of alignment, but there's a couple of things that are pretty different. And you're kind of getting pulled in different directions. And sometimes you might be able to go, well, look, that cohort seems to have these needs, that other cohort. And then, you start to develop all these kind of sub-segments, I guess. Yeah. I know there's no perfect answer for this, but what would you do? Because I know a lot of people I've been working with have that situation where, look, I think my solution or my business is really targeting different people, different needs, different problems. But when I'm doing the research, I'm kind of getting mixed feedback. So do you have any suggestions on how to proceed?
I think this is where when we're starting to get down the patch, we've gone beyond contextual, and we've gone, yes, there's something in here, but it seems like a smaller group of people, or we've got diverse needs. This is where your surveys or your quant comes in. You need to understand the size of the market and what's it worth it to you. So if you do like we did with that insurance example, we identified a significant number of people were behaving in an unfortunate way that was not aligned to our kind of where we needed to go. The solution that we had in place was not going to work for them, but they were the majority. We needed to make a decision. Well, will we pivot our idea and change it because we want to address that big part of the market? Or will we look at this other smaller segment that actually deliver us more value? You need to qualify that at a point. And because you're placing bets on different horses, and you'll split your attention if you go down both. And so you need to understand what the trade-off of that is. And you might need to have separate solutions. And so elements of your solution might work for one group, but not the other, or vice versa. And you need to make a call on whether you'll continue to invest in both sets, or if there's one that you'll go for first, or if there's just one that you'll leave out. And so that's a business decision. And research should inform our decision making. It shouldn't be like you do it, but you ignore what it tells you. If you get to an impasse like that, one, you could go back and see if your research design is actually the problem. So are you just asking the wrong questions? Is there something internal happening where you are seeing these splits? Because that can happen too. You get two different stakeholders who have different views on something, and they're saying the same things, but they're talking about different things. So you want to check that's not you first. But if the data is reliable and it's telling you, no, there's something happening here, and it's splitting in different directions, you need to make a call on what are you going to do with that? Because that could be that you come up with different solutions, or you need to concentrate on one group or the other. And I suppose each business needs to make that commercial decision for themselves of what they're going to do. But if they ignore it, then they just cost themselves time and money.
And this comes back to your point at the beginning about, what is the business trying to achieve?
Yep.
Does this new feedback fit in with the direction and the vision and the purpose that we had, or are we just getting pulled in a different direction? So I've seen that happen pretty often as well, is that you uncover things through research that put the business in an awkward situation. We're like, well, you don't really want to do that. But that's what people want. It's like, but that's not too far from our core, outside our risk appetite.
And sometimes it's when you don't walk away from those things that you really get yourselves into trouble. So I've worked in businesses who have doubled down on kind of putting extra money into their solution, or trying to make an audience swing to, it's just education, or it's just time. And when they finally have then delivered, it's cost them so much, and then the market's just not there, or it just doesn't address the needs, or something superseded it because they've taken so long kind of having those internal arguments and trying to make it work. And so sometimes research does tell you things you don't like, home truths you don't want to hear, or the market moves. And we've probably seen how that can happen during COVID, how quickly things can change, and how needs can suddenly, I mean, needs usually stay about the same, but the solutions that address them because there's some other paradigm can really be fundamentally different overnight. And so you want to, don't do research if you're not going to listen to what it tells you. Like it's a de-risking solution. It's an insurance policy. And so if you're not going to, if you're not going to pay heed to that or call on it when you need to, there's no point. You're just lying to
But you also
yourself.
do it at your own risk, right?
You do.
You do it at your own risk because
Absolutely.
you're ignoring market feedback. Okay.
Yeah.
Last question. A lot of our listeners are on the I'm trying to get funding journey. And I'm sure you've done this plenty. You've done it with me before. So you are using research as a way to inform your decision, as a way to justify this direction versus that direction. So can you share a little bit about how research helps get stakeholders over the line? How it's not just, oh, we feel warm and fuzzy because we really understand customer needs, but what is it that investors like from research?
For research, if you do it, it's the insights that you get from research, and it's how you package that up to be to inform. When we inform people and when we know something about something, that de-risks it, or at least it makes it tangible for people. So they see the potential, or they see where we have a set of problems where our solution might work, or for whom it might work for. And as an investor, I want to have as much knowledge as possible. All investors want as much control over what's going to happen with their money and their investment. And so if you can use it to tell a story, but also give the data and kind of help people feel encouraged that they're on the right track, that's when it works. That's when it helps get over the line. But it's got to be in a language and positioned in a way that speaks to that investor. So you've got to think about who your audience is. And sometimes it's either too dry or impenetrable, or it's too, I find some of it can be very ephemeral and kind of like an insight, what does that mean? It's not hard enough. And so you've got to think about, how are you going to tell your story? Who's that audience, and what is the language they speak? You've got to speak in a language they speak. Otherwise, they just won't understand it. So again, I'm all about the context. Like, I don't make the same output packs for every audience. They are different. If I will use quant and qual if I'm talking to an investor. I'm not going to just give them the fluffy stuff. I need to give them hard stuff too. And when we don't know things, we need to outline it as well. So it's about knowing how to speak to people and what is going to really resonate with them. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that point on, tell them the bad news as well. Don't just sweep that under the rug and hope for the best, because they will pick it out, right? And there's no point in hiding.
Well, and sometimes they don't, because they also, we've got commitment bias too going on. So, if I've already committed to something, if this is something that I want to be successful. And so we sometimes need to save people from themselves and point out the elephants in the room. And those really, people don't want to listen to those humans.
No, they make you very unpopular. I've had that situation.
Yeah. And so you've got to be brave. You don't want to sugarcoat them. You want to make them as unemotive as possible, but really salient. Like, people really have got to understand the risks they take. So I pose them as, here are the risks. These are the set of assumptions. This is what we know. This is the potential. This is, and like, the potential can be from here to here. Know that we could hit here. It doesn't mean we're going to hit here. So like, just letting them know, like, what are you actually committing? What are you up for? What is the gap between our knowledge? And, if we invest a little bit more in research, we might get a bit further, but sometimes we just need to also take a punt. Like, you can research to death as well and never do anything. You can get paralysis as well with that. And so sometimes there's a point where you need to take some risk, but that's why I like doing lots of little research all the time, because it helps to de-risk things and keep things under control.
And I think I could tie that back to also another idea of, if we were all imperfect vegans, the world would be a better place, right? So if we were all imperfect researchers, that would be better than not doing any research at all.
Absolutely.
And just assuming everything, right?
Yeah.
So even if we don't sort of nail it, even if we're not as experienced, as knowledgeable as you are, there's definitely value in going.
Yeah, and I mean, I started not being a researcher and teaching myself through some good tutelage, but to the point now where, I'm very confident in what I'm doing, but I didn't go to university to study research. It's something that I like and that I have practiced for the last 20 years. So anyone can get good at it, at the kind of research that I do. It just takes a bit of investment, and there's plenty of books and people who are willing to help you. And it's about trying it and reflecting on what worked and what didn't. We're all capable of talking to other people. We do that all the time. Human beings are already doing a lot of that. It's more about what do you do with the data? That's a whole nother chat of how do you take the data? And there are some pretty simple things you can do of how you can analyze data. Again, it's a bit of practice, but that's the important part. It's what do you do with what you hear and see? How do you make sure you don't bring your bias into it?
And it's a constant struggle. Like I'm fighting with that all the time because everyone falls in love with the things that they've been working on for months and months and months.
Sometimes we hear things and we fixate on the one thing we hear because it matches up or it just catches our attention. It's about listening in between and kind of being fair to everything you hear.
I bought this book years ago. You'd probably love it. It's called This Is Not a Book, maybe. And it's got a whole bunch of different biases that we have in our reasoning. And you're not even like 10 pages in and you're like, oh, holy shit, how do we ever make any kind of, and we don't, right? So research is kind of inherently subjective because it's someone's opinion applied to another person's opinion, right? But it's the only kind of tool that we have.
I mean, I would say it's inductive. So, and that's fine. Inductive reasoning is what science is. There's most of what we base science is also inductive reasoning. And you could say that they don't have viewpoints. Of course they do. Of course they have biases and they bring that to their work, but we still trust it. And so if you follow the right methodology, and you understand that you are biased and that everyone around you is, that's just a risk that you build into it. Things are not going to ever be 100%, but we can be pretty certain of our conclusions. And so if you know how to practice that and how to do that inductive reasoning, it actually gets easier and you can be quite confident that you're on the right track, that you're pointing in the right direction. And so it is better to talk to someone than to not talk to someone. Putting something in front of someone, you're always going to get some reaction and it'll be helpful. Yeah.
Awesome. Louise, I'm just going to sum up a couple of the points that I've been furiously capturing as you've been going through this. One of the things that I really like that you mentioned, that research is a tool to de-risk. It's a tool to tell a story. I think that's super valuable to people to approach it that way. Is like having a customer conversation not only is going to get you on the better path to a better solution, but it also de-risks a lot of the other parts of your business model. And obviously, we all like stories. We all like human connection. Absolutely. So use those insights to bring them into the story that you're telling to pitch for funding. Yeah. I also really like the point that you made that anyone can have customer conversations. Better to do this often than to do one big chunk up front and then forget about it, put it in the closet forever. I also appreciate this idea that thinking about the objectives up front and the objectives of the research is just as important as the research itself. And when we go and meet people, it's just as important to understand the context and to observe that context. What are they doing it? Why are they doing it? And to do as much attentive listening as we can, right? Because I read a book from this guy who was a hostage negotiator for the FBI. And they reckon that every time they were negotiating with whoever the hostage taker or the terrorist was, they would have one person that would just be like speaking and doing the listening, or sorry, speaking to the terrorist. And there were like 2 or 3 people that would just be like listening and writing, right?
Absolutely.
Because when you're having a conversation, you're sometimes already sort of thinking about what the person is going to say, and you're trying to come up with the next question.
You're trying to
in
engage
mind.
them.
So you're not really listening. So sometimes it's actually, it's really hard to listen properly.
Absolutely. And I always take a note taker with me, a real person, not just my recorder. And the key to that is I can have a discussion with them afterwards. And I almost always give them space to ask some questions, because as you say, they are noticing other things that while my brain is trying to remember the next question, or where I'm going to take this, or how do I get this back on track, they've heard something that I haven't picked up on. And that's so valuable. And those are usually my stakeholders. And so that gets them in it, but they ask great questions. And so that's
good.
Always take people with you, because sometimes technology fails too. And as much as I listen back to something, sometimes it just doesn't work. And so having another person there to reflect with, but also who takes those physical notes, is super important.
Nice. And then the last point I took down, which I thought was pretty valuable, is if you're going to go for a survey, just try and get some help, or maybe get someone else's impression. But again, think about the objectives and don't take the results of the survey as the gospel, because you might have written the questions in a leading way, and it's better than nothing. But I wouldn't sort of hide behind a survey as to justify all of my decisions as a startup.
Yeah, I'm always very skeptical of surveys. Thank you.
Amazing. Louise, you've been super, super helpful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that passion, that knowledge that you've had. I wish we could do some work together in the future. And again, thank you from all of our listeners for your time today.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure, Leo.